So, talking with Dave Fitzgerald's vocab, and Dave's been talking for a little bit, and one thing we're going to talk about is, if Jesus was not a historical figure, what do we do with Paul? So it would be my contention, I would say, that Paul, writing between the 45, 65, kind of 20-year time window in general, makes mention in his epistles, even though his primary purpose is not to write biographies, they're occasional letters, makes mention of historical facts about Jesus. David, in general, I think would say those are interpreted wrong or interpolated. And so he's not going to answer every one. We already said this, but he's just going to sort of give a general idea.
Just because we would be here all day long doing it. Yeah.
So like when I would go to Galatians, like I would look at things that seem to be specific things where Paul is
that's a
mentioning.
good place to start, because I think Galatians is the zoom in. That's the best argument for historicity is in Galatians.
Yeah, and so this is probably written 50s, you know, maybe 55 or something is I think maybe slightly earlier with Galatians.
Sure.
Like in Galatians 3:1, Paul says, "It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified."
And that's an
Galatians
interesting thing, that he was publicly portrayed as crucified. He doesn't say, before your eyes, you know, you heard that before your eyes people were proclaiming this. You know?
Well,
But anyway,
you've got eyes and you've got public.
You.
Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, curses everyone who hanged on a tree. So it's saying he was hung on a tree, and then it says, and here's the scripture backing for it. Galatians 3:16, which talks about Jesus is the offspring of Abraham. Galatians 4:4, which says God sent forth a son born of a woman, born under the law.
Let me stop there for a second, because that's an interesting thing too.
Yeah.
The fact that he has to say was born of a woman, that's such a weird, bizarre thing to say about anybody, you know, unless you're talking about a demigod already, who had a divine father and a mortal mother.
So what's the evidence you would have that you would say that Paul
It's just an observation. It's just an observation.
Because, I mean, you know, the context is, you know, Jewish understanding, not
Sure.
pagan, you know. They don't have physical gods who are going around impregnating human women in Jewish context.
In a Jewish context, but Paul's not your typical Jew either. You know, he says things that you wouldn't get from a Jewish context.
He's the apostle to the Gentiles.
And we were talking about that yesterday, about the Kyrioi and the
Lord,
the Lord, and that he was saying there are many Kyrioi and many gods and many Kyrioi, but for us there's only one.
Well,
you know?
the thing is, I guess you could say, hey, I have a question about that, but we would just say, born of a woman, that's a hint towards the virgin birth. It doesn't say born of woman and man.
Wait a second. Oh,
well,
I don't know. That seems reaching.
Here's what I'm saying, though.
Because Paul never mentions anything about a virgin birth
let's just say for a second, you're a Christian, and you believe the gospel accounts about Jesus, and then you read this. How difficult is it a stretch to say that's a hint towards the virgin birth, born of a woman?
But it looks like the earliest witnesses we have, or the earliest traditions, I'd say, didn't include a virgin birth.
But here's the thing. If you have Paul believing that Jesus is a heavenly being who was never physical, what do you do with born of woman, born under the law? What do you do with that? That's what I'm saying.
Earl Dory would answer this very well, and Richard Carey would too. If you look at Jewish writings like the Ascension of Isaiah, they have this idea that there's these levels of heaven. You know, like Paul mentions, somebody went up to the third heaven. You know, they believe that in these heavens, there's everything you have on earth, like we see in the book of Hebrews. There's a holy sanctuary, a holy high priest in heaven, and there's heavenly flesh. There's trees, everything we can find on earth. You could even die and be buried in heaven, as they say about.
Is there the law up there too?
Sorry?
The law.
The law?
Yeah, born under the law. Is there the law in this heavenly realm?
Well, that's kind of a conceptual thing. I'm talking about physical things like him.
So there's birth.
Him being born,
there's
him
birth,
being crucified, him dying and rising again.
So
all those happen in a context of being on one of these levels of heaven.
So there's sex, there's birth, and there's
everything. Everything we've got on earth is
you've got to have the law.
It's supposed to be a pale copy of what's happening in heaven.
But if you're saying,
so in that context, yes, they do have law.
If Paul is saying that, okay, so you understand that sounds like a twisting of the text. It's much
How so?
Because
we actually have those texts where they're describing that, and they're describing Jesus or the Christ Messiah figure coming down level by dying and being crucified by the princes of the powers of the air, not by earthly authorities.
So in this letter, he says, publicly portrayed as crucified before your eyes. You have the same guy a chapter later saying,
He's
born
not
of
saying
woman,
you
born
have
under
seen
the
it
law.
yourself. He said you have seen this publicly proclaimed.
It was before your eyes
that
Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed.
Publicly
as crucified.
portrayed was publicly
So you have
portrayed.
eyes, public, crucified.
Publicly portrayed.
So
That's what I'm saying. Not saying,
what does it mean then?
It's
you're
not saying you've seen him be.
Even though it says it was before your eyes.
For instance, like in the verses where he says that up till now, the Son has been a mystery hidden away in heaven, but now he's visible on earth, even though this is after Jesus is meant to have died, through revelations and scriptures and the words of preachers like himself. We see that repeatedly said.
Do you see how it feels like you're not answering publicly portrayed in this phrase
well, you
before
keep
your
saying
eyes?
that's to say that he's saying that you've seen this. He's not saying you've seen this.
Before your eyes.
He has seen you see other Christians portray this.
Were they drawing
What does portray
pictures?
mean? Well, maybe it means acted out as a mystery, as a ritual, a mystery faith.
Okay.
Ritual. I don't.
We have no evidence of early Christian worship of people imitating the crucifixion. In fact,
That's saying
David,
something. We've seen
check it out.
portraying it.
In fact, in our earliest Christian art, it's a little bit before they are okay to even draw.
And when you say earliest, we're talking like 300 years after the fact.
Well, there's some. Yeah, there's probably some.
And you're talking about the earliest catacomb art.
There's catacomb art primarily. 200s, 300s. We got this Christian art.
Yeah.
You can get a book of it. And there's all these scratches on the walls and stuff.
Sure.
And a lot of it is like Jesus is a shepherd. A lot of it is Jesus with fish stuff. The loaves and the bread. It's those kinds of things.
Right.
But you also do then start to get crucifixion stuff. And in fact, one of the earliest sort of
the graffito.
the Alaxamanos graffito. You have
what a trippy picture that is.
Yeah, it is. You have for those who haven't seen it, you have a figure on a cross scratched out,
a donkey head,
and then a donkey head. And it has a guy with his arms prostrate, and it says Alaxamanos worship your God, or
worships his God.
Worships his God.
Yeah, and you can just picture some guard, scratching that on the guard post, saying, "Ha ha, there's your God, Alaxamanos."
Yeah, so it's by the Palatine Hill there, and see, I would say that even the mockery goes to show a few things. That mockery of the crucifixion victim that you worship. It shows the unlikelihood of inventing a Messiah who's publicly portrayed as crucified before others' eyes. And it shows how it was a sore point for Romans to say, look at your God. He's a crucified, and they put a donkey's head on it. Which actually goes back to making fun of Jews as well. The whole donkey thing. Like there was these rumors that Jews went to the temple and worshipped an ass.
Right. And I'm sure that's exactly where that came from.
There's actually a technical word called ass worship. Which is interesting.
But and the thing I want to say about, that's a strange thing, but that Christianity isn't even the strangest cult that was going on around that time.
Oh, but I wouldn't say that.
Look at Addis. That is a bizarre cult. Do you know what they were doing?
Well, I know some of what they were doing. The thing is,
they were castrating themselves in the street and throwing their balls in a bowl to Addis.
Yeah,
and that freaked the Romans out too, even worse than Christianity did.
People getting drunk and eating raw meat.
Exactly, the Dionysian. Yeah, absolutely.
But so
I'm just saying, you can't say, "Oh, no one would ever think of that," because people thought of all kinds of crazy shit in the first century.
I'm not saying that Christianity was the weirdest one, and therefore look, it's still.
But it's not. I'm just saying it's not so weird that no one would have imagined such a thing.
Well, so there would be a disagreement. I will say no one would have imagined to say the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, is going to be crucified on a Roman cross.
Except those Jews who started saying, you know what? Let's look at the suffering servant. Let's look at Psalms 22. Maybe that's not about this. Maybe that's the Jews who became Christians.
Okay, so you know what's so interesting about that? Like if you read the Passion narratives, a lot of them, they have Psalm 22 running throughout the narrative, which begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right. And you see things about bones not broken, the garments. But what's so interesting is even though there's a very clear thing you could make use of, which says they've pierced my hands and my feet.
Well, some people have argued that that's not a good translation.
Yeah, no, they'll say something like "there's lions biting at my feet" or something. But the question is, what would that mean in this context? The funny thing is, they don't exploit that passage. My point is that this idea that they exploit every single thing in there is simply not true.
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that either.
The Christians just make Jesus fulfill prophecy.
Well, they definitely were cherry picking.
Here's the other thing,
definitely were cherry. And Matthew can see him doing it because he even says when he does it.
When they do say it was fulfilled, if you notice, a lot of times it does not fulfill the event in the expected way.
Well,
it's of
here's
a
the
radically
thing.
different nature because
it's even worse than
they
that.
They don't
it's
have
even worse than
the word
that.
Pleroma, fill up. I forget the total Greek word, but it has pleroma in it, which means full. the word fulfill
Yeah.
doesn't just mean the way we think of prophecy now. Oh, this date in 1915, this will happen. That's not their understanding. The idea is to give it the full picture. And so if you look at the way they have Jesus fulfill prophecy, it's not even the way that we think it needs to be. It is of a different nature.
And I agree with you, but it's even worse than that because a lot of times he's
say
not fulfilling
worse.
prophecy.
I'm just trying to say,
but
understand Jewish interpretation.
Saying, well, I'm saying the interpretation is not even that straightforward because a lot of times, like for instance, this perfect example, what we're talking about, the 22nd Psalm, that psalm, when you read the whole thing, it's about a man who laments, he feels abandoned by God, and by the end of the psalm, he's come back to God, and he's gone to the church, and so there's nothing messianic about that on the face of it at all.
Well,
at all.
You know that the Jewish rabbis had certain psalms they marked off as messianic, and they tend
But that wasn't one of them. That wasn't one of them.
That's the point,
until you get to
hold on,
the first century.
What you said is really interesting, because they had clear ones they viewed as messianic psalms that would fulfill messianic expectations, especially the Ascension Psalm. I will ascend the throne.
Absolutely.
Here's what's so interesting. That's my point, is the radical reversal to now the Christian saying, no, the suffering servant, these getting beat and shamed.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Apply to the Messiah.
And
that's
when did that start? That started when the warrior Messiah, who was going to come and restore the throne of David and take over the world, they had oodles and oodles of messianic prophecies like that. They all failed because Rome kicked their ass, the Greeks kicked their ass, Israel kept getting, its ass handed to it. And so those messianic military messiahs, those were a non-starter, They just couldn't win. But when they said, oh, here's what really happened, and we saw this with, like, Harold Camping when he tried to predict the end of the world, and then said, like every other crazy apocalyptic preacher who gets caught with his pants down afterwards, oh, well, it was a spiritual judgment. We didn't see it, but it happened in heaven or something. It was terrible.
Here's the thing, though, David.
And it's exactly the same thing. Yeah.
You're saying it's prophecy of the fact, but here's the thing is, though, those early foreshadowings of what the Messiah would be, they're actually in the text. So Isaiah 53 actually exists 700, 800 years before Jesus or so.
Sure.
These prophecies actually are in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's not like they're also inventing prophecies filled. And
Matthew is.
A lot of them.
A lot of stuff Matthew says is fulfillment of prophecy isn't prophecy, or they're from Scripture we don't know. We don't have it. It's not in our Old Testament. That is true.
There's no time where he'll say, according to Scripture, that doesn't exist. There's times...
You are wrong, my brother.
There's times
you are wrong, my brother.
There's times where he'll do this. He'll paraphrase something, or he'll even interpret the prophecy and then say, and it was fulfilled, when it's not a literal phraseology. Like with Nazareth is probably the best example.
Sure.
Or there's times where he'll name one guy's name, but it's a combination of two. But he never says prophecy, and it's literally nowhere to be found.
That is not true.
What is it?
And again, I've got a whole 700-page book at home. I can bring it out. I've got the whole chapter, and we can talk about it on Skype or something.
But your contention is, okay, that's fine. We don't.
And I even break down into like 7 types of ways that they give us prophecy, and 7 ways that it fails, especially in Matthew. Matthew's the worst of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of the arguments you would make to say, look, if you made these kind of arguments, Jesus didn't fulfill this, look, those would be a lot of similar arguments that, like, a religious Jew who was not a Christian would make in the 1st century, or the 2nd century, like with Justin Martyr in the dialogue with Trypho, the Jew.
Yeah.
Those are similar, and that's why the cross is a stumbling block to religious Jews who do not accept Jesus as Messiah.
But it's not just the cross. It's like the Greeks seek
cross
after
is
wisdom.
The big one, and everything it represents.
But look what else he says. The Greeks seek after wisdom, and the Jews seek after signs.
Yeah.
But Jesus did give wisdom, and Jesus did give signs. So why aren't those stumbling blocks? That's saying that there wasn't a Jesus to show him giving wisdom or giving miraculous signs. John even numbers the signs for us.
Well, he doesn't literally number them.
He literally numbers. Says, and John did, and
he says
Jesus
one.
First,
he says this is the first.
Here's the great thing. He does the first, and then later he says he did the second, and I think he goes up to 6 or
most
people
people count 7, but you could count more.
But the funny thing about that is, it says at this time Jesus did his first miracle. Then a couple verses down, and then he did many other signs, and then at this time he did his second sign. So we know things like John's book were getting padded by other editors, even if we didn't read that the endings have been slapped on at the end. And speaking of endings slapped on, it looks like we're running out of time.
We'll do that. That's the gospel section.
Yeah. Thanks. I gotta say, I love talking to you because A, you put your money where your mouth is. You know what you're talking about. You're not just saying, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. This is not the end of the dialogue.
Yeah, well, you could never